The Lord of the Rings movie trilogy is one of the best-loved book-to-film adaptations of all time. Yet Peter Jackson did take some creative liberties during the process of converting the books into a screenplay, leading to some major and widespread misconceptions. Some of the changes made by Peter Jackson are fairly minor, such as how events appear to unfold very quickly, when in fact they took place over the course of a number of years. But some are more striking, such as the altering of the personalities of major characters or the complete omission of some of the most major events of the books. So join me as we unravel the top 10 Lord of the Rings movie misconceptions. In the films, we see Uruks being cut free from their birthing sacs, which are buried within the muddy pits that fester beneath Isengard. This striking vision suggests that Saruman had devised some form of biological sorcery through which the Uruk-hai were bred. This imagery impresses upon the audience the cruelty of Saruman's industry, whilst also conveying that this new race of orc had been bred with unnatural speed. Yet in Tolkien's writings, the truth is far less sensational. The Uruks, like all orcs in the books, reproduce as men and elves do, and Saruman had already begun recruiting the orcs of the Misty Mountains into his service as early as the year 2990 of the Third Age, around 30 years prior to his war on Rohan. These forces were indeed quartered in the pits beneath Isengard, and it is likely that this detail gave rise to the filmmaker's notion of birthing pits.
They took me and they set me alone on the pinnacle of Orthanc, in the place where Saruman was accustomed to watch the stars. There is no descent, save by a narrow stair of many thousand steps, and the valley below seems very far away. I looked on it, and I saw that, whereas it had once been green and fair, it was now filled with pits and forges. Wolves and orcs were housed in Isengard.
In reality, the Uruks are not conjured monstrosities, but simply a stronger, more resilient strain of orc. They were not unique to Isengard either, for Mordor also bred these formidable warriors, unleashing them upon Gondor. The divergence between the books and the films in this instance creates a problem beyond petty complaints regarding canon accuracy, for the images presented of the Uruks birthed in pits carries with it the suggestion that evil has the power to create life anew. However, Tolkien reminded us time and time again that evil cannot create life or fashion anything truly new. It can only mar, twist, and corrupt what already exists. So while the films depict Saruman's brutality in a way that sears itself instantly into memory, Tolkien's own telling roots the Uruk-hai firmly within the natural order of his world. In the movies, one of the most moving moments comes when Haldir leads a company of Galadhrim warriors to Helm's Deep, their arrival igniting hope amongst the defenders as they stand side by side with the beleaguered men of Rohan. But in the books, no such aid ever arrived, and the Hornburg is manned by the Rohirrim alone, with Legolas and Gimli being the only members of other races present amongst the defenders. This is not because the Galadhrim were idle or uncaring, but because they were beset by dire threats of their own. Pressed on two fronts by the orcs of Moria and of Dol Guldur, all of their strength was needed to defend their own lands. Fans of the movies will also remember the moment when Éomer and Gandalf arrive with reinforcements to lift the siege. Yet in the book, Éomer is not a rescuer from beyond the walls. Rather, he is within the fortress, standing shoulder to shoulder with Aragorn throughout the long night.
"Come," said Aragorn. "This is the hour when we draw swords together."
Running like fire, they sped along the wall, and up the steps and passed into the outer court upon the rock. As they ran, they gathered a handful of stout swordsmen. Together, Éomer and Aragorn sprang through the door, their men close behind. The two swords flashed from the sheath as one.
"Guthwine!" cried Éomer. "Guthwine for the mark!" "Andúril!"
cried Aragorn.
"Anduril for the Dunedain!"
As in the movies, at dawn, salvation arrives, but not with Éomer at the head of a host of riders. Instead, it is Erkenbrand, Lord of the Westfold, marching at Gandalf's side and leading a force of infantry. So, in the tale as Tolkien wrote it, the men of Rohan did not look to elves for deliverance, but to Erkenbrand and to the White Rider. In the movies, Saruman is depicted as being a puppet of the Dark Lord, and as the eye of Sauron burns within the glassy surface of the Palantir, his voice is heard, and he commands the corrupted wizard to build him an army worthy of Mordor. Yet in Tolkien's writings, Saruman's motivations are far more complex, and Saruman certainly did not raise his legions at Sauron's bidding. In fact, he had been weaving his own dark designs long before he ever dared to gaze into the Palantir. He did not begin using the Stone of Orthanc until the year 3000 of the Third Age, but his dark thoughts and rising ambitions can be traced back long before this. Saruman had already turned his gaze upon Rohan with ill intent some 50 years prior, and his war against the Riddermark was fought in large part due to his own belief that the One Ring might be found there.
His thought is ever on the ring. Was it present in the battle? Was it found? What if Theoden, Lord of the Mark, should come by it and learn of its power? That is the danger that he sees, and he has fled back to Isengard to double and treble his assault on Rohan.
Saruman deeply coveted Sauron's ring for himself. He dreamt not of serving Sauron, but of mastering him, of claiming the Dark Lord's throne of shadow and dominion over all Middle-earth. Gimli hints at the rivalry between Orthanc and Barad-dûr when he speaks with Gandalf, pointing to the enmity that lay between these two great powers.
"'Tis a pity that our friends lie in between," said Gimli. "If no land divided Isengard and Mordor, then they could fight while we watched and waited. The victor would emerge stronger than either, and free from doubt," said Gandalf. "But Isengard cannot fight Mordor unless Saruman first obtains the ring."
Having said this, there is of course a measure of truth in the movie's portrayal of the relationship between Sauron and Saruman. For although Saruman's descent into corruption began long before he ever gazed into the Palantir, it was through the stone that Sauron's influence began to grip him. Under the Dark Lord's spell, Saruman's will began to falter. He came to believe that Sauron's victory might be inevitable. Although he secretly still dreamed of seizing power for himself, he no longer opposed Sauron's victory and began to feign loyalty and obedience in the hope of securing a place of high honour in the world that Sauron would fashion from the ashes. In the films, Elrond proclaims at the Council of Rivendell, "You have been summoned here to answer the threat of Mordor." It is a powerful line, yet this statement actually contradicts Tolkien's writings. In the books, none of the members of the Fellowship are in fact summoned. Instead, they each arrive at Rivendell through chance, or perhaps through the mysterious workings of Providence. Legolas finds himself present at the council only because he carries an urgent message from his father, Thranduil of Mirkwood, for Aragorn had recently captured Gollum in the Dead Marshes and delivered him into Thranduil's keeping. But Gollum, with the help of a sudden assault by orcs, slipped free of his captivity and vanished once more into the wild. Thus, Thranduil sent Legolas to Rivendell to inform Elrond and Gandalf that the twisted creature was at large once more. Gimli's presence was also not due to a summons. Rather, he travelled to Rivendell alongside his father, who had come as a messenger from the Lonely Mountain. For a servant of Sauron had appeared at the gates of Erebor, searching for Bilbo Baggins. Glóin, Gimli's father, being an old friend of Bilbo's from the days of The Hobbit, was deeply troubled by this, and so, wishing to warn Bilbo that the servants of the Dark Lord might be hunting him, he sought out his old friend at Rivendell. Yet it is Boromir's arrival that is perhaps the most mysterious of all, for both he and his brother Faramir were haunted by a strange and prophetic recurring dream in which an unknown voice spoke cryptic words of guidance. "Seek for the sword that was broken. In Imladris it dwells. There shall be counsels taken, stronger than Morgul spells. There shall be shown a token that doom is near at hand. For Isildur's bane shall waken, and the halfling forth shall stand." Faramir longed to follow the guidance given in the dream and to seek Imladris. Yet the path northwards was one of great danger. Therefore, out of love and duty, Boromir chose to take the perilous journey upon himself. Thus it was a dream, and Boromir's resolve to follow it, that led him to the council, not to the summons of Elrond. And so each comes for a different reason, with their own stories. This is likely why Peter Jackson chose a simpler explanation, for to explore each character's path would simply demand too much screen time. So, although this alteration to the tale is entirely understandable, we should remember that, in the books, the Fellowship is formed by the powers of Providence, making their union all the more meaningful and profound. In the films, Sauron is iconically depicted as a vast burning eye that crowns the pinnacle of Barad-dûr. In the books, however, Sauron had actually rebuilt his physical form over 2,000 years before the events of The Lord of the Rings. And by the time that Frodo set forth on his quest, Sauron dwelled within his Black Tower in corporeal shape, locked away from the world, but most terribly real. The Eye of Sauron only appears a handful of times throughout the books, and when it does, it is as a vision, a symbol of his piercing will which conveys the ceaselessly searching nature of his gaze. The filmmakers likely drew part of their inspiration for the Eye of Sauron from a moment in the books when Frodo, looking toward the dark fortress, witnessed a sudden tongue of fire flare from a high window near the tower's crown. And then he saw, rising black, blacker and darker than the vast shades amid which it stood, the cruel pinnacles and iron crown of the topmost tower of Barad-dûr. One moment only it stared out, but as from some great window, immeasurably high, there stabbed northward a flame of red, the flicker of a piercing eye, and then the shadows were furled again, and the terrible vision was removed. Sauron's eye, glaring from the summit of Barad-dûr, has become one of the most iconic shots in the history of cinema. And though it differs from Tolkien's description, it does not disturb the story in any meaningful way. For in the books, Sauron never stirs from his tower throughout the entire tale, and so the fiery emblem above his fortress serves as a suitable representation of his presence. It is a change that deepens the atmosphere of the movies without betraying the spirit of the books, which is why it endures as a true favourite amongst fans. In the films, elves are portrayed as graceful, ethereal, and intensely serious, whilst dwarves are shown as jovial, comical, and as the butt of the occasional joke. This reflects a wider pattern we see in popular culture, where tall, elegant, or beautiful figures are associated with wisdom and maturity, whilst shorter, rougher, or more rugged characters are treated as comic relief. But Tolkien himself imagined the two races quite differently. In his books, the dwarves are not comical, but are a people of great gravity. They are proud, fiercely protective of their heritage, and often possess deeply serious attitudes. The elves, on the other hand, whilst unquestionably wise and noble, are also prone to being far more light-hearted than their cinematic counterparts. They sing, they tease, and they delight in playful mischief. Take, for example, the time that the Fellowship struggled to cross the Misty Mountains. And Legolas could not resist needling Gandalf in the midst of a snowstorm. Their retreat was now difficult. It might well prove impossible. Only a few paces from the ashes of their fire, the snow lay many feet deep, higher than the heads of the hobbits. In places, it had been scooped and piled by the wind into great drifts against the cliff.
"If Gandalf would go before us with a bright flame, he might melt a path for you," said Legolas.
The storm had troubled him little, and he alone of the company remained still light of heart.
"If elves could fly over mountains, they might fetch the sun to save us," answered Gandalf.
Or recall Bilbo's first arrival at Rivendell when the elves spotted the company in the distance and erupted into song, and their voices carried like laughter through the trees.
"Oh, will you be staying, or will you be flying? Your ponies are straying, the daylight is dying. To fly would be folly, to stay would be jolly. And listen and hark, till the end of the dark, to our tune, ha-ha!"
Tolkien's elves, of course, are not to be taken lightly, and their lords and ladies are counted amongst the wisest in all of Middle-earth. Yet their merriment and outlandish humour brings a brightness to their character. Meanwhile, the dwarves' weighty dignity, their air of secrecy, and the tragic burdens of their history lend them a sense of stature and nobility. Whilst the depiction of elves and dwarves in the movies fits more closely with our expectations, we should remember that Tolkien viewed things very differently. In the films, Aragorn arrived at the Pelennor Fields, leading the army of the dead, the spectral host crashing like waves upon the ramparts of Minas Tirith, cutting through the orcs with ease and turning the tide of battle. Yet in the books, the role of the dead is far less straightforward. In fact, it's never made entirely clear if these ghostly warriors are even capable of striking a physical blow against an opponent. Instead, Aragorn uses them only to terrify the corsairs of Umbar at Pelargir, causing them to abandon their ships in fear. And with the corsairs scattered, Aragorn seizes their vessels and gains the means to sail swiftly north. At that moment, he holds the ancient oath of the accursed men fulfilled, and he releases them. And so in the books, Aragorn does not sail to Minas Tirith with a legion of phantoms, but with living allies. Now men leaped from the ships to the quays of the Harland and swept north like a storm. There came Legolas, and Gimli wielding his axe, and Halbarad with the standard, and Elladan and Elrohir with stars on their brow, and the dour-handed Dunedain, rangers of the north, leading a great valour of the folk of Lebanon and Lamadon, and the fiefs of the south. But before all went Aragorn, with the flame of the west, and Duriel, like a new fire kindled, Narsil, reforged as deadly as of old, and upon his brow was the star of Elendil. Had Aragorn arrived at the White City with the army of the dead at his back, the people of Gondor would have recoiled in dread, seeing not the return of their rightful king, but the coming of a dark necromancer. Indeed, we are told that during the march from the Stone of Erech to Pelargir, those who dwelt in the lands between fled in fear before Aragorn and his ghastly companions, and they named him the King of the Dead. Aragorn's arrival at the Pelennor Fields in the books is one of majesty, which pays tribute to the glory of the kings of old, and it aids Aragorn in securing the loyalty of his subjects, rather than their fear and suspicion. The passages describing the Battle of the Pelennor Fields are among the most powerful in the entire saga. And even if you never read the books in their entirety, it is still worth turning those pages, for there, the full measure of Tolkien's literary brilliance can be found. In the films, Denethor is painted as little more than a villain, a one-dimensional figure portrayed as murderous, foolish, and tyrannical. Yet in the books he is far more complex. Though proud and wary by nature, Denethor is also deeply intelligent. a formidable steward, and in many ways a man of great strength. And his story is one of the most tragic in all of Middle-earth. He rose to the stewardship upon the death of his father and quickly proved himself a masterful ruler. Denethor succeeded to the stewardship in 2984, being then 54 years old. A masterful man, both wise and learned beyond the measure of those days, and strong-willed, confident in his own powers, and dauntless. But only 4 years later, he was struck with grief once more due to the loss of his beloved wife. This wound cut deep, and Denethor became a more somber man, grim and silent, burdened by sorrow. Yet even in mourning, his mind turned ever towards Gondor's fate. He long foresaw that Sauron's attack upon the world of men would come in his time. And in desperation, he sought knowledge to prepare his people. So it was that Denethor turned to the Anor Stone, the Palantir of Minas Tirith. Through it, he gained great wisdom and glimpses of far-off lands. His insight grew so great that the people marvelled at his knowledge. But this power was not without peril, for at this time Sauron was gazing into the Ithil Stone in nearby Mordor. And discovering that Denethor too was using his Palantir, the Dark Lord attempted to seize control of the Anor Stone and bend it to his will. Yet Denethor resisted him. The steward's strength of character, combined with his noble lineage, which gave him a birthright to the stone, enabled him to defy Sauron and retain control of the Seeing Stone. Yet his use of the Palantir left its mark. It drained his spirit, aged his body before its time, and planted in his heart the belief that Sauron possessed such overwhelming might that his eventual victory was inevitable. Despair began to gnaw at him, and the death of his eldest son, Boromir, struck him with a grief beyond measure, and his growing hopelessness was soon to deepen further still, for his last surviving son, Faramir, was struck down by an arrow and afflicted with the black breath of the Nazgul, a fatal malady which caused its victims to slip into a dark, cold sleep, never to recover. Denethor was a man of great strength of will and maintained the integrity of his personality until the final blow of the apparently mortal wound of his only surviving son. He was proud, but this was by no means merely personal. He loved Gondor and its people, and deemed himself appointed by destiny to lead them in this desperate time. Believing that Faramir was inflicted with a mortal blight, Denethor's resolve finally broke. He abandoned the leadership of the city, leaving command to Gandalf and Prince Imrahil, whilst he kept vigil at his wounded son's side. Denethor's despair did not spring from weakness, but from years of loss and trial. The death of his father, the death of his wife, the loss of Boromir, and the apparent loss of Faramir, all compounded by the visions of the Palantir and the battle of wills against the Dark Lord himself. In the end, Denethor was indeed overcome, yet a lesser man would have broken long before. In the films, after the ring is destroyed and Sauron is finally defeated, the hobbits return home to find the Shire untouched, just as green and peaceful as it ever was. But in the books, the story takes a darker, more unsettling turn. When the hobbits return from their quest, they do not come back to the same Shire that they left behind. Rather, their lands were twisted into something almost unrecognisable. Imposing gates had been raised. Great plumes of smoke drifted in the sky. Many trees had been felled. Grim structures of industry had appeared, and the once cheerful lanes were now being patrolled by sheriffs and ruffians. Many of the houses that they had known were missing. Some seemed to have been burned down. The pleasant row of old hobbit holes in the bank on the north side of the pool were deserted, and their little gardens that used to run down bright to the water's edge were rank with weeds. Worse, there was a whole line of the ugly new houses all along poolside, where the Hobbiton Road ran close to the bank. An avenue of trees had stood there. They were all gone, and looking with dismay up the road towards Bag End, they saw a tall chimney of brick in the distance. It was pouring out black smoke into the evening air. Sam was beside himself.
"I'm going right on, Mr. Frodo," he cried. "I'm going to see what's up. I want to find my gaffer."
A sense of oppression hung in the air, and the simple joys of hobbit life, beer in the taverns, pipeweed by the fire, had been stripped away. Even food was being rationed. What was once a place of laughter and plenty had been transformed into a place of want and fear. The hobbits, however, were not broken by this sight. Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin rose to meet this new challenge. Realising that their trials in distant lands had prepared them for this very moment, they rallied their fellow hobbits, awakening the courage which lay dormant within a people who had long lived in peace. This gathering of unlikely warriors led to the Battle of Bywater, one of the few battles fought within the bounds of the Shire, and a moment of triumph when ordinary folk rose together to reclaim their land from those who sought to corrupt it. And behind this corruption was a mysterious character named Sharky. This ominous figure held the Shire in his grip, orchestrating its fall into ruin, and his presence in the tale marked the final trial for the hobbits, and leads me to the last of our Lord of the Rings movie misconceptions. Although Saruman's death is not shown in the cinematic version of the movies, in the extended edition, the defeated wizard meets his end at the Tower of Orthanc. After a bitter exchange with Gandalf and the triumphant Lords of Men, Grima Wormtongue stabs him in the back, and Saruman tumbles from the heights of the tower, his body impaled upon a great spiked wheel far below. Yet in the books, Saruman's fate unfolds in a darker, quieter way, and is bound to the tale of the Shire, for the mysterious figure who took command of the land under the name of Sharky was in fact none other than Saruman himself. For after Frodo and his companions had set out on their quest, Saruman's ruffians had spread across the Shire and had been tightening their grip upon its people ever since. And so after his defeat, Saruman turned his attention to the Shire once more. Yet, after Isengard fell to the Ents, Saruman was trapped in the Tower of Orthanc. However, he retained the gift of his voice, a power that bent even the strong-willed to his purpose, and with careful words he persuaded Treebeard to allow him to depart Orthanc, playing upon the old Ent's distaste for the caging of living things. Thus, freed by guile, he turned northward, Wormtongue slinking at his side, until they reached the Shire. There, Saruman sought not a new land to rule, but only revenge against Gandalf and the hobbits who had defeated him. The full tale of the scouring of the Shire and the Battle of Bywater is too great to recount here, but if you wish to hear the full story, click the link on screen now. After the Battle of Bywater, Frodo pressed on homeward, and the final confrontation with Saruman came at last when he reached Bag End. After finally stepping foot into his home once more, he heard the voice of Saruman coming from the doorway behind him. A group of angry hobbits had also gathered around Bag End. Yet, despite all the ruin that Saruman had caused, with mercy born of his long journey and the wisdom of his suffering, Frodo offered the disgraced wizard the chance to depart in peace, hoping that he would repent of his evil ways. But ultimately, Saruman's own cruelty sealed his fate. Saruman laughed.
"You do what Sharky says always, don't you, worm? Well, now he says follow."
He kicked Wormtongue in the face as he grovelled, and turned and made off. But at that, something snapped. Suddenly Wormtongue rose up, drawing a hidden knife. And then with a snarl like a dog, he sprang on Saruman's back, jerked his head back, cut his throat, and with a yell ran off down the lane. Before Frodo could recover or speak a word, 3 hobbit bows twanged and Wormtongue fell dead. To the dismay of those that stood by, about the body of Saruman a grey mist gathered, and rising slowly to a great height, like smoke from a fire, as a pale, shrouded figure, it loomed over the hill. For a moment it wavered, looking to the west. But out of the west came a cold wind, and it bent away, and with a sigh, dissolved into nothing. Thus Saruman's life ended not at Orthanc, but in the Shire, where the tale began at a hole in the ground, where once again there lived a hobbit. Thank you very much for tuning into Realms Unravelled. I would like to take this opportunity to light the beacons and call for aid. If you did enjoy this video, I would ask that you kindly click the like button below. Also, I would be very grateful if you would consider subscribing and clicking on the bell icon. And until next time, farewell fellow explorers of Middle-earth.